Ah,
Okay, so roll.
must I roll?
It's ja.
O genade.
Ja, sorry.
I have to have a very sensitive finger. You'll see why. Okay, so as I said, I'm a biologist. I'm interested in biochemical processes, what happens in the cell. Sorry, what happens in the cell. But also, I'm interested in what can biosemiotics bring me in terms of understanding what happens inside the cell. So let us look at a simple, basic biological process that happens in metabolism. It's probably the primary code relationship in the cell is where the nucleotide sequences of messenger RNA is translated into the amino acid sequence of a polypeptide. So the one is the sign for the other, and it's mediated by the ribosome. So typically, as a biologist, I would look at it slightly different because I was thinking, where does the polypeptide come from? Where do the amino acids come from? So it's a catalytic process which couples amino acids together into a polypeptide using that sequence information, which is different from Shannon information, Carl Levy, right? I hope you, yeah, so I could use information in a different way, not in the Shannon way. And so you have a process. So in a generalized, one would then say that the mRNA is a sign vehicle, a representamen, ribosome, the interpretant, and the polypeptide, the object. But from a biological point, we use different language. We say we have a catalyst on the one hand and a template, and the template serves as the information in how to couple substrates together to give a product. My project today is to show you that we can actually talk about both of these things and combine them if we translate these concepts into Aristotelian causes. And this is what I try to do. But my problem is that if I do it as a biochemist, I'm going to lose my audience because you don't know these basic biochemical processes. If I look at the abstracts, which I had privy to beforehand. So I decided I'll do something different. I will tell a story. So I come from Stellenbosch, which is 50 kilometers from Cape Town. And in Cape Town, we have the noonday gun. Since 1806, this gun has shot off its boom, yeah, every 12 o'clock, every day, except Saturdays, Sundays, and public holidays, except Sundays and public holidays. It's the oldest daily gun in the world. So when I visit Cape Town, when the gun goes off, invariably I look at my watch and I see it's 12 o'clock. And I wonder, how does the guy up there, the naval officer, know when to shoot the gun? Which is a question you could ask. And there's a very amusing story about a tourist came to Cape Town, walked down Long Street and saw there was a shop with lots of watches and clocks in the window, and they were all set exactly to the same time, and this intrigued him. So he walked into the shop, asked the watchmaker, how do you know how to set your clocks to the correct time? He said, well, it's Cape Town. We have a noonday gun. So when the noonday gun goes off, I set my clocks. And the tourist thought, very interesting. And he walked up Signal Hill to where the noonday gun is, and he talked to the naval officer, and he asked him, how do you know when to shoot your gun? He said, well, I've got a telescope. And there, down there in Long Street, there's a watchmaker shop. And I just look at when the clock goes 12, and I shoot the gun, right? Of course, this is an apocryphal story, and it's just a nice tale, but it is a nice way of trying to explain what happened. So it's the saga of the noonday gun and the watchmaker's clock. And they are locked in a very interesting cycle. It's not a feedback cycle. It's something that happens simultaneously. The gunshot and the setting of the clock goes off at the same time. And they don't know about the rest of the world. And so they are locked into their own little world, which is similar to this idea of the Ouroboros, of this ancient symbol for eternal cyclic renewal, the snake that eats its own tail, except, of course, here we have two snakes that eat each other's tail. So this is an analogy for the type of cycle that happens here. And what I try to do now, using, you'll see, Aristotelian causes, to unpack exactly how all these elements involved in the cycle play together. So on the one hand, we have the naval officer, we have the noonday gun, the clock, which strikes 12 noon, and then the gunshot. On the other hand, we have the watchmaker and the clock that he's working on, and the gunshot and the setting of the clock to 12 noon. So those are the players in this tale. So if I take a semiotic view, and take a Persian triad. Then we have the sign vehicle, which is the clock striking 12. Yeah, they're looking through the telescope, and the interpretant, the naval officer, setting off the gun to give the meaning of that 12 o'clock on the, the 12 sign on the clock. On the other hand, we have the watchmaker who interprets the gunshot into set the clock to 12, right? So we have two Persian triads, which in some way work together. But as a biologist, I can ask a different question. I'm actually interested in the biosemiotic process, not in the relation, but how the whole thing happens as a process. So then I would ask two questions. Because of what did the noonday gun fire? What is all this, let's say, the causation of the noonday gun firing, or because of what was the clock set to 12 noon? And this brings me to Aristotle, who very early on, centuries ago, decided that science was the answering of why questions. This is what many people say. Science is the answering of a why question. But that's not what he asked. He asked not why, sorry, but sometimes this thing happens, but diati, which in Greek doesn't mean why. It means something more like by virtue of what did it happen, or on account of what did it happen, or because of what. Three ways of asking that question. So actually, we are not looking at causes, but at becauses. We want answers to particular questions. Because of what did something happen? And Aristotle said there are four ways of answering the question, the four so-called aitia, which now we call causes, but they're not causes. They are explanatory factors. They are becauses. Why or because of what? Because. So if we think of, for instance, of a substance X, and we ask the questions, what makes the subject? We can X, we can say, what is X made out of? What or who made X, in the sense of who produced X, or what made X happen? And then what makes X to be the form, to be what it is? What is its form? And then, of course, for the sake of what is X made for, its purpose or its function. And then we have the four Aristotelian aitia: material, what is X made out of? Efficient, who or what made X? Formal, what is it to be X? And final, what is X for? So actually, we have to ask four questions. We have to ask from what, by what or who, to be what, and for what. Those are the four Aristotelian aitia questions. So let us look at because of what did the noonday gun fire? Well, there's a material cause there, which is the gun. It's from the noonday gun that the shot arises. It's made by the naval officer who lights the fuse to be the sign for 12 noon and for telling Cape Townians the time. That is the purpose or function of the shot. On the other hand, because of what was the clock set to 12 noon? Again, the material cause is from the clock itself, which doesn't appear in the sign relation. The sign relation does not talk about material causes. From the clock, by the watchmaker in this case, to be the sign for the 12 noon gunshot. And of course, the purpose is for setting the clock to the correct time. This is a list of these causes. What Robert Rosen, who was a theoretical biologist, some of you may know about him, his main work was done in the 50s of the previous century, 50s, 60s, and he wrote a book very influential called What is Life, published in 1991. And what he realized is that actually these idea of Aristotle, the becauses, are related to each other in a particular mathematical formulation called a mapping. So what is a mapping? In so-called relational biology, which Robert Rosen started and was taken over, and further by his student Aloysius Louis, who's written quite a number of books on this. In relational biology, everything is a set, and every process is a mapping. So you can use the mathematical formalism of category theory, category of sets and mappings, to create a formal representation of this sort of signed relationship that we were talking about. So every process is a map. What is a mapping? Mapping is simple. If you have a set A and a set B, a mapping takes every element from set A to a particular element of set B, to only one. And so you can have a diagram, and this is the sort of diagram that Rosen proposed. So F acts on A to give you B. In category theory, the mapping, you can also talk about an arrow or a morphism that maps a source into a target or an input into an output. You can think of it as a process. And you can either look at the objects themselves or elements within the objects. So this is what's called an element tracing diagram. And what Rosen realized is that he could think of this mapping as a relationship between efficient cause that acts on a material cause to give you an effect. So that is the basis of relational biology. So we have three of the four Aisha, two of the four Aisha here. We can ask what is final cause. So if you think about it, the function of F is to produce B from A, and the purpose of A is to be that from which B is produced by F. So in fact, B is there for the, and it's unfortunate that this happens at the bottom, but B is there for the final cause of both the efficient cause and the material cause. This is a very useful way of putting these together. So what's missing? And Rosen, unfortunately, never really talked about formal cause. There was one or two papers where he tried to incorporate it, but it was never part of his formalism. And I think that's a huge mistake, because you need formal cause, and it's extremely important if you want to answer the sort of questions that Rosen actually himself was answering. So what is it? Formal cause is the answer to the question, what is it to be something? In fact, it's what is to be this instead of something else? You can also think of that something, what is it to be something? That something being the actualized form of some prior model, what's called the formal cause. And I use model here in a very, very broad sense. It's a prior existing representation or conception, such as a mental or a concrete image, an idea, a propensity, a constraint, a sign, design pattern, blueprint, template, program, mold, pattern, archetype, or even a prior example. Very broadly, these can all be formal causes within such a system. So if we ask, how does formal cause, how can we incorporate formal cause into this mapping that I've just shown you, then there are actually four ways of doing it. The formal cause can be an intrinsic part of an efficient cause or a material cause. And that way I use the symbol sigma, the red sigma for formal cause, and I use it then as a subscript to efficient and material cause. But it can also be a separate entity that acts together with the efficient cause to give us the effect. So the efficient cause cannot act without the formal cause, and the formal cause cannot be actualized without the efficient cause. So you either have a single entity or a pair of distinct entities. So you have four ways of incorporating the formal cause into the mapping. Here I use, this is a construction from category theory. All that this means is that the pair of them, they are separate entities, but they act together as the efficient, as the processor to process A to B. And all that these projection arrows mean is just they are separate entities that can be part of other relationships. Here, of course, the two entities are fused together in this particular case, either with the efficient cause or with the material cause. And here, the material cause and the formal cause act together to give us the effect. And I'll give you examples of all four of them. But let's quickly get back to the noonday gun and the watchmaker's clock. So if we translate the story into the two halves of the two snakes of the cycle, we have this type of form, this type of effect. This didn't come out very nice. Oh, it shows there. It's this one that we are concerned with here. The naval officer and the clock are two separate entities, but they work together in order to get the noonday gun firing. And on the bottom, we have separate entities, the watchmaker and the noonday gun firing, to act as the processor to give us the setting of the clock to 12. So you have this type of system. you can see that these two are exactly the same things. In this case, this is the effect of the first process, but it's also the sign for the second process. So we can you can equate them together. They're exactly the same thing. And we have a hierarchy. And now, of course, you can close the hierarchy because these two things happen at the same time. The observation of the clock that sets off the gun and the setting of the clock to 12 happen at the same time. So you can also close them together. So you have what's called a hierarchical cycle. You can form the hierarchy in a different way as well, but there you have a problem because the two clocks here are not the same. The one is fired on day one. Sorry, the one is set on day one when the clock fires, and then 24 hours elapse, and then it's the clock, when it strikes 12 again after 24 hours, it is the sign. So you have another type of cycle, but there's a delay built in. So what is the picture that you get here? Is a picture of an instantaneous event of the firing of the gun and the clock set. And then you have a delay, and then 24 hours, you have the same event happening. And this happens, it never stops. You can even have the time going wrong. So if some of them, there's a slight delay in the setting of the clock, then the whole thing starts shifting and drifting away. But the two guys, the naval officer and the watchmaker, don't know about this because they are locked together in their small world. It needs somebody from outside to come and say, you made a mistake. Yeah? You have to reset your time to some atomic clock somewhere. So this is a very useful way of thinking about all these things. Thank you. So what we have here is a cycle that is closed to formal cause, to formal causation. Formal causes are both produced within the cycle. If you change the formal and efficient causes around, then you have another type of cycle, which is closed to efficient causation. And this is the one that I'm personally interested in because that's what happened inside the cell. And you can, of course, have a mathematical formulation of that in terms of category theory. You can also actually think of it as a two-member cycle, yeah? But that obscures the relationship between efficient cause and formal cause, so I don't find that useful. Close to efficient cause, if you're interested in how it works inside the cell, here's a paper that I recently wrote in 2021, Biochemically Realizable Relational Model of the Self-Manufacturing Cell, where I explain exactly how this hierarchical cycle works inside the cell, which is close to efficient causation. Okay, now I'll get back to biology, but very shortly, to show you examples of all four of those ways in which formal cause can be incorporated into the mapping. So here's one where the formal cause is embedded in the efficient cause. Think of a carpenter who has an idea in his head, a map in his head of how he wants to build a table, and he converts the wood and the screws and the glue, the material cause, into the table, right? If the carpenter dies, the mental image dies with him, right? They're not two separate entities. In the cell, the perfect example is an enzyme active site, which has the binding and catalytic specificity, which selects substrate and converts them into product. Whether this is a semiotic relationship is, as you've heard now, is contested. Doesn't matter for me because as long as I can understand it in terms of Aristotelian causation, at least I've got a handle on it. So there's examples. There's a phosphatase that converts glucose 6-phosphate into glucose and PI, or a ribozyme with self-cleaving specificity. You have an intact ribosome, cleaved ribosome. But the essence here is that the efficient and formal causes sit together in the same entity. Separate entities, we've now seen a few examples of that. Here is a carpenter that doesn't have a mental image, but he has a drawing of the table, separate object. If the carpenter dies here, the drawing is still there, another carpenter can build the same table. So there the two are separate, but the effect, of course, is the same in the end. And we've seen examples of this now. You have a ribosome, messenger RNA, and you have a translation in biology. You have a copying of the one strand of DNA to the other strand of DNA in replication. You have transcription, where the DNA is transcribed into an RNA strand. So these are all examples of systems in which the formal and efficient cause are separate entities. for me was very interesting because I didn't realize this before, but the formal cause can be embedded in a material cause. Now think of this. There's a metal called nitinol, which is a very interesting metal. It has shape memory. So if you take, say, a copper wire and you make a nice fancy three-dimensional structure and you wind the nitinol wire all around it, right? And you stick it in a water bath at 70 degrees, then you anneal that metal. If you take it out, you unwind it, you stretch that nitinol wire out, and you start feeding it back into the 70-degree water bath, then it starts folding up by itself. It has the memory of the whole three-dimensional structure it has inside it. But what is crucial here, so the sign for the 3 dimensions is embedded in the material cause. The efficient cause is actually the context in which that can actually happen. So the 70-degree water bath is the context for the folding. So this is very interesting because that's what happens in the cell. You have a functionalizing context. You have, say, an unfolded polymer sequence, like an amino acid sequence. You put it in the correct chemical environment, the intracellular milieu, and it folds up spontaneously into the correct three-dimensional structure. So that's a very interesting biological example. So you have folding of polypeptides, folding of polynucleotides, all in terms of an efficient cause, which is an intracellular milieu, and a formal cause, which sits inside the material cause. And then lastly, sometimes you have a material cause and a formal cause acting together. My nice example is if you have a suitor who wants to get married and he asks his girlfriend to get married, and she says yes. What does he do? In certain Western cultures at least, puts a ring on her finger. And the ring on her finger is then the sign that she is going to be married. So if you stick a lot of females in a room together and you ask, who are going to get married, you look at fingers on the ring on the finger. And here the formal cause actually becomes associated with the effect. As you can see here, it remains there. So you have beautiful examples of so-called tagging inside biological systems. So here are 4 examples of tagging. So you have in the protein synthesis, you have an amino acid being tagged with a messenger RNA, and you have acetylase, methylase for DNA. You have ubiquitin tagging enzymes or proteins to be degraded. So what's useful for me is I can think of all these processes locked together in a network, and I can see for each of these what type of formal cause incorporation is there. There are, does it show there? That's that type. There's this type. There's the folding type. And there is the type where, in terms of enzyme catalysis. So I can make sense in terms of all these relationships. Some of them are signed relationships. Some may not be signed relationships. Some may, like tagging, is the production of something that serves as a sign. So sign production for me is also a very important concept. So I'm finished, and I hope that I persuaded you that this is a fruitful way of thinking about signed relationships being embedded in signed processes as well, and that you can actually use Aristotelian causes to make sense of the whole soul. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jannie. We have time for 1 or maybe 2 questions. Let's start in the room, Carl.
So would you agree that your approach could be called like a causal analytic or causal analytic, but not necessarily mechanistic? Like the
Not necessarily mechanistic?
Yeah. You know,
well, yes.
because it's not like, yeah.
I would think it's a causal analysis, but not causes in the
Exactly.
In the everyday way, the way we use the word.
Exactly, but you can sell it like that, and they will like it because I like it. Like even like a trick the mainstream scientist.
Yeah. So I can sell it to them. I think as a real causal analysis.
It's very persuasive. I like it.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah.
May I ask, what is the source of indeterminacy?
In these, look, these are well, some of these are deterministic processes, right? Some of them are not. So the transcription, the translation of mRNA to protein is not a deterministic process. It's a conventional process. Yeah, the genetic code is a convention, right? Whereas for the enzyme, I agree that that's deterministic in the sense that it's a chemical reaction which is just speeded up by or made possible by the enzyme, but it's already a determinism between substrate and product.
Deterministic convention.
No, it's not deterministic because I can change the rules. Yeah. So the rules are it's like the Morse code. You call the Morse code deterministic? No. There's no deterministic connection between da and R and A and da and B. Yeah. That can change. And exactly, there is no deterministic relationship between a triplet in mRNA and a amino acid. I can change that. It has been changed. Yeah, it has been changed experimentally, so we can do that. So that's not deterministic. But the tagging, for instance, is a deterministic process. But it allows me to distinguish between these things quite nicely.
One quick one.
May I ask a question? My question would be, how is the...
You spoke about four types of causality, but really Aristotle described four aspects of causality. In this case, your construction will be safe or destructed.
I'm not sure I've got the last part of your question, but Aristotle,
If we will deal with four aspects of causality,
yes.
this is safe your construction or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So Aristotle didn't, he said four aisha, four aspects, four aspects of a full explanation. That's exactly what he meant. So that's why I like to call them becauses, not causes. There are four becauses that together give you the full explanation for a phenomenon.
But this is essence for you, Aristotle or medieval interpretation, or medieval scholastic interpretation.
Look, they were interested in things like primal cause, St. Augustine, yeah? But they had many sensible things to say about formal cause. They had this idea of an exemplary cause, which is a sort of a prior model of something. So, of course, I don't, out of my own philosophy, don't agree with primal causes and God and this sort of thing. So they were much interested in that. But the thing is that they had many sensible things to say about the Aristotelian causes. And it's now coming back. There's a huge swing in philosophy as well towards more Aristotelian analysis instead of Humean causality, which of course, Humean causality is descriptive and this one is explanatory. And I have to stop you.
Thank you very much.